I'm going to show you exactly how much money I make from this podcast, how I do it, how I did it, and how anyone else can do it too with 6 or 7 simple pieces of advice. I've not seen any other podcasters tell you the things that I'm about to tell you about this business, about this medium, and about this industry. This week, we're going to do something different on this podcast. This podcast is about how you can build a successful social media channel or personal brand, and also how much money you can make from a podcast. At the end of the day, I just sit here and talk. So I think people typically assume that having a podcast is just a labor of love. However, this podcast will make millions this year. I'm going to show you exactly how much money I make from this podcast, how I do it, how I did it, and how anyone else can do it too with 6 or 7 simple pieces of advice. So without further ado, I'm Stephen Bartlett, and this is the Diary of a CEO. I hope nobody's listening, but if you are, then please keep this to yourself. Here's the thing. I started doing this podcast 3 or 4 years ago with a £90 microphone that I bought in Apple that I plugged into my laptop. I put a duvet over my head, 3 a.m. in the morning, and I went downstairs into the quietest part of my house. There was no script, no plan, no team. I edited it myself. I engineered the audio myself, recorded it myself on my own, and I sat there and just spoke into a microphone about my life. And here we are, 3 years and 10 months later, and the podcast has done very well. It's now the most listened to business podcast in Europe. It's sat at #1 in the charts almost consecutively for 40 weeks straight. And as I said, it's become a multi-million-dollar business since I founded it. And here is my first piece of advice if you're thinking about getting into the podcast game. I published my first podcast episode 3 years and 10 months ago. But for the first 3 years, I was never, ever consistent with my podcast. When I started, 1 month I might release an episode, and then there might be a gap of like 2 months or 3 months or a couple of weeks. Then I'd pop up with another episode, and then there'd be a huge gap again, and so on and so on and so on. And whenever I was consistent and managed to publish predictably every Monday for several weeks in a row, the podcast audience would grow and grow and grow. And you could see on the graph that the podcast growth was compounding. If I then took a month off, it was almost like I was back to square one again. You could see on the data, when I would come back from my little hiatus, less people were there to listen. So I realized very quickly that if this podcast was going to really work and reach its full potential, then I had to figure out how to be consistent. So 10 months ago, I made the decision that no matter what, we would publish an episode on Monday, every single Monday. And from that point onwards, the growth absolutely exploded. If you're watching this on YouTube, here's the actual graph of listeners from the minute I started being consistent with publishing the podcast every single Monday. The growth exploded by 10x. 10 times higher. And as I said, this is not a lesson on podcasting. It's a lesson on all facets of life, whether it's building a business, getting millions of followers on Instagram, or even getting into the best shape of your life. Figuring out a way to reach that point of sustainable consistency was the key to explosive growth and progress. That is a fundamental lesson of my entire life, one that it genuinely took me 27 years to appreciate the value of being consistent at almost anything. Consistency unlocks everything. It teaches you faster than everybody else. It compounds growth. And as it relates to content and building audiences, it helps to establish a cadence which keeps them coming back for more. We publish every Monday morning at 7 a.m. because I know roughly 50% of podcast listeners listen in transit, which means on their way to work, on a flight, on a train, on a walk, or even like on a running machine at the gym. So I want my audience to know that on Monday morning, before you start your week, or as you're getting ready for the week ahead, or during your Monday morning commute, you can count on me to be there every week right here. And that predictability for your audience allows them to fit you into their habits. My second piece of advice is also a tip about how to grow a podcast and how I grew this podcast. In order to grow this podcast, I had to find a way to reach new audiences and to pull them in. So I opened up this podcast to other entrepreneurs, to successful people, to the guests you've seen, to come here and share their diary in the way that I did when I started this podcast. And those guests bring their audience with them. And the podcast started to grow faster and faster and faster, faster than ever before. But it also saved me tons of time. Having a guest means I could just walk in, sit down, ask them the things I'm interested in, and have a great conversation, which now takes me just 2 hours to record. If you want to grow your own podcast, you need to figure out where this growth is going to come from, where that organic growth is coming from, because Spotify and Apple Podcast stores and apps don't have any viral discovery. You can't just hit retweet or share. So to grow your podcast, you need to figure out how your podcast is going to reach a new audience and do it often. And for me, this is achieved in two ways. As I said, by bringing guests in, but also by having the YouTube channel. There's a lot of content discovery happening on YouTube. Every time you watch one video, it recommends another. And sometimes that video is going to be the Diary of a CEO. So we get a lot of new listeners coming in through the YouTube channel. And in future, they might decide to listen on Apple or Spotify or to stay on YouTube. Okay, my third piece of advice is actually a bit controversial. So if I found the conversation with a particular guest to lack value or to be boring, then I know you will too. And keeping that trust with you, to me, is so unbelievably important. It's not nice for a guest to have their episode of a podcast deleted. And I'm sure some of them have been a little bit pissed off historically because I might have wasted their time. I imagine if I was in their position and I went on a podcast, I traveled to it, and then I found out that it had been deleted, I would be annoyed too. But as I said, all of this stuff to me is secondary to producing a piece of work that me and my team can be really, really proud of. And if we're not proud of it, then you won't ever see it. And that's a standard that we'll always maintain. It's not happened a lot, I've got to be honest, maybe 3 or 4 times in almost 100 episodes, but it's an important point. And I think having a standard drives all of the other work you do up. So even though we've only deleted 4, it's definitely meant that we've set a higher bar for ourselves as a team because we know that it's possible that episodes can get deleted if they're bad. My fourth point is probably the point you guys want to know about the most, which is money. Before 10 months ago, the podcast was basically just a hobby. 10 months ago, when I realized I was going to do this podcast once a week and launch this YouTube channel, I realized I would need camera equipment, a location to film it, and a team to help me put this whole thing together. My goal, as I said to the team at the time, was just to break even. Podcasting can be remarkably cheap, especially if you don't want to video it. You can start with a $100 microphone like I did, as long as you have a laptop, and edit it yourself and record it yourself. You can do it over Zoom. But because I wanted to do it big, I knew I needed to find a way to make money from this podcast. People had historically told me that there is no money in podcasting. They'd shown me the depressing numbers that you'll see if you Google the term, how much money can you make from a podcast? And those numbers work out the revenue potential based on how many downloads or listeners you're getting. And then they offer you some kind of dollar per download. Most podcasters make their money from reading out adverts in the middle of a podcast episode. And most podcasters get these advert deals from some kind of podcast advertising company that acts as a middleman between the podcaster and the brand. So point number 5 is the approach that I took. I knew the typical way of monetizing a podcast was never going to be enough to cover my costs. So I cut out the middleman. Here's what I did. I made a list of 5 companies that I genuinely use every single day and have done for years. Companies that have helped me in various aspects of my life and or companies that I really loved in terms of their mission and values. I made a nice little presentation deck, which was just 2.5 slides long, showing my audience, the growth, and I got hold of the email address of the CEOs of those 5 companies. I sent them all an email explaining exactly why they should sponsor this podcast, my ambitious plans for the future. I told them that I was a customer of their brand, proved I was a customer, and I told those companies that I would make this podcast the #1 business podcast in Europe if they backed me, and I would do it within 12 months. One of them was the CEO of a company called Huel, a guy called Julian Hearn. And he called me the next day offering to support me, this podcast. He knew I'd been a customer for 3 years because I talked about Huel all the time anyway. He knew every single word I was going to say about Huel would be the truth. And he's never, ever, ever told me what to say, how to say it, what to promote, or anything like that at all. He simply believed in me. He backed me. He liked the show. And I guess because I'm a genuine Huel customer, he knew I would be a benefit to his brand. And no bullshit, I am a Huel customer. I realize creators and influencers say that a lot because they have to. That's what they're getting paid to say. But no, I'm a super customer. I have 2 Huel fridges in this building alone that I'm recording this podcast in now. 6 tubs of it over there on my fridge. If you opened up the cupboards, you'd find Huel products. A few months after Huel backed the podcast, I actually asked Julian, the CEO, if I could invest in the company too. And I ended up being a pretty significant investor in the business. And I also now sit on the board too. So a really, really amazing relationship, and one that is based in authenticity. And that's all because I cut out the middleman and I went directly to the brand that I loved with a really compelling pitch and a very ambitious plan for the future. It's not often or typical that a creator or an influencer goes and pitches themselves to a brand. But I swear, if you have the guts, skill, effort, and hard work to do that, you can get amazing deals and deals that are authentic to you. And for me, that was the most important thing. Another company that replied to me was Fiverr. The same thing. They believed in me. I'd actually worked on a project with them before. I used their products. I've used Fiverr across a whole host of portfolio companies that I'm involved in. I use it for everything from graphic design to video to audio editing to translations, you name it. I contacted the global marketing director who I'd never spoken to before, found him on LinkedIn. I told him about this podcast. I hopped on a Zoom call with him, sent him some stats around the podcast, told him about my plans, and they said they'd sponsor the podcast too. Again, they've never told me what to say, how to say it. They leave me alone, and that makes everything much more authentic and much more honest. And I think you guys can tell. Lastly, my third sponsor is My Energy, my newest sponsor, an absolute phenomenal British success story co-founded by a remarkable entrepreneur called Jordan Brampton. And so I reached out to Jordan because their values and missions are completely aligned with mine. I asked if they would support the podcast, and they too, after a Zoom call and a few chats, said they would love to. And my relationship with My Energy has got closer and closer and closer. And I'm now involved in a lot of other things within that business too. I asked all of my sponsors for a 12-month contract, which allows me to plan further ahead and to forecast and to hire. And I genuinely have such an amazing, relaxed, trust-based relationship with all of them, which means I have that freedom to speak about my relationship with their brand in my own way, in my own words. And that, as I said, is incredibly important to me. Outside of those key sponsors that I've mentioned, I have the odd brand collaboration or opportunity maybe once every other month, which I might mention on the show from time to time. And my three key sponsors and my other sponsors pay varying fees depending on what I do for them. But all in all, this year, this podcast will generate over $1.2 million, which is just over $100,000 a month. And there is money in podcasting, and you can turn it into a really lucrative business. My last point is a bit of a bonus point, and that's about why I wanted to do the podcast in the first place. And since launching it, the new reasons why I carry on doing it. I started the podcast because I believed in the medium of podcasting to communicate ideas and to tell stories and to connect with an audience. In a world now where everybody is so obsessed with reach, like 1 million views, 1 million impressions, podcasts sat alone as a different channel because it offered depth. When I started the podcast, I was also making videos on Facebook Watch. And I remember making 4 videos that ranged between 3 million and 33 million views. On average, those 4 videos did 10 million views each. The views were staggering, huge view numbers. However, the videos were like 2 to 3 minute, kind of viral, semi-forgettable, highly relatable videos that after watching, most people never really remembered ever again. And one of the sort of like real world measurements that I have about how much the content I make online is connecting with people is when I meet people in the streets or on a train or an event, what they mention. And people never, ever mentioned my Facebook videos. And so for me, that meant that those Facebook videos weren't connecting with them at any real depth. When I started the podcast, although at the very, very beginning, I was getting thousands of listeners, I would get stopped all the time. Even though it was doing 100 times less the views as my Facebook videos were, when I was getting stopped in the streets, it was getting 100 times more mentions. And the essays I would get in my DMs, the long sort of anecdotal explanations about how it had impacted people meant way more to me than getting a really big reach number. And so I made the decision that I found the depth much more enjoyable. It was having a greater impact. And when I'm producing content that I hope will help people, I think of it in terms of the time it takes me versus the impact it has. And in that department, podcasting sits absolutely alone. The audience is smaller than the viral videos I used to make, but the impact is 100 times more profound. None of you can remember the last thing you saw on Instagram. You can't remember the last photo you tapped, the last reel you watched, but all of you can remember the last movie you watched on Netflix. And I think that's the perfect example of how reach can be quite meaningless, but depth can be incredibly impactful. It stays with you. And for me, podcasting an hour long and 2 hours long sometimes at real depth on very emotional topics has a tremendous amount of impact, which makes it all for me incredibly worthwhile. And the other really unintended consequence of doing a podcast was it forced me to keep a diary, to then sit down at the end of the week and look at that diary and to reflect and to take lessons from my experiences. We all go through life experiencing things. Those that stop, look at what's happened, pick it apart, analyze it, and form conclusions on it, will learn more in the same amount of time because they're taking more from their experiences. My diary, keeping a diary, analyzing it, and taking lessons from it genuinely made me smart. It genuinely helped me understand myself. It grew my self-awareness. And even if I didn't have a podcast or an audience, I would recommend that everybody does that. Journal. Have something where at the end of the week or at the end of the day or whenever you want to do it, you reflect on the experiences you've had and you extract the maximum amount of learnings from them. I never expected that, but being forced to produce content, whether it's on Instagram or a podcast or on YouTube, really accelerates how much you learn. Learn about the world, learn about the topics you're discussing, but most importantly, learn about yourself. And the other really unintended consequence of starting a podcast, especially one that's now videoed, is it's helped me sharpen my sword in terms of my skills, in terms of how I speak, communicate my ideas, present on camera. And those are skills that are so incredibly important in the day and age we live in, especially in the social media era. So I would deeply encourage everybody to find some type of way, especially if you're young and you're growing up in this social media era, or if you're someone that wants to improve your confidence or get better at sales, I would find a way to create a pact with yourself, like a promise. My promise is I have to show up on Monday and make this for you. Create a pact where you have to consistently produce content. As I said, it improves your ideas, it improves your ability to speak, and it also helps you on camera, which is an important skill in an era where everything seems to be recorded. And the other really unexpected upside of having a podcast and inviting guests on was you genuinely make amazing, potentially lifelong friends. There's this TED Talk I watched probably about 4 or 5 years ago. And it's, I think it's called like the 35 questions to fall in love with somebody. And it's basically this list of 35 questions that if you ask somebody and then spend 4 minutes staring in their eyes, apparently you're supposed to fall in love with them. Now, of course, that's bullshit, but there's real psychological evidence to support why that would help you connect with somebody. And the truth is, as humans, when we open up to somebody else and they open up to us, it's been proven that it's easier to connect with them. So after sitting here for 2 hours with a guest that I've never met before, talking about their childhood and things they've been through and their mental health problems and their struggles and their dreams and their ambitions, after the podcast finishes filming, honestly, in like 90% of the time, I feel like they're my mate, and they genuinely 90% of the time will say to me, let's go for dinner, let's go for a, and they genuinely mean it. And I genuinely do. Like, I had Reggie Yates on the podcast, never met him before. A couple of days later, I'm at his house and I'm having dinner at his house. Liam Payne, never met him before, came on the podcast, was at his house 2 days ago. And we're genuinely really good friends now. And it's the same with all of my guests. I go to their birthday parties, I go to their weddings sometimes. We become really, really, really good friends. And it's because we connected from a place of vulnerability. I never expected that. And for me, that is reason enough to launch a podcast. It expanded my professional network, but it also expanded my friendships. And that's really what I wanted this podcast today to be about. I wanted you to know that you can start your own podcast. And even if you don't go for the full production studio like I have, you can make enough money to live off. Think about it. I get paid to sit and chat with other people that I think are amazing. That is an unbelievable privilege. So what are my plans for the future of this podcast? If you know me, you probably already know the answer to that question. I want to take it to another level. As you may have seen, we launched the Diary of a CEO Live, which is our live event. And we sold out Manchester's Albert Hall. We had thousands of people there. And it was, I think I'm safe to say, totally unexpected. A big production. It was theatrical in its nature. There was sort of like special effects and stuff, video, music. It was all there. And it was a really, really, honestly, one of the most powerful evenings of my life over the last 5 years. Maybe the most powerful thing I've ever done. Maybe. And we're now going to tour that across the rest of the UK, coming to 5 UK cities first and foremost, which I'm going to announce shortly. And in other elements of this podcast, we're going to continue to take it to another level. Guests are going to get even better. Production's going to get even better. And hopefully I'm going to get even better too. And most importantly, we're going to continue to be consistent at something that we all very much love doing.